All right, everybody, welcome back. Hope everybody had a wonderful spring break. I know you probably couldn't really go anywhere or do too much, but either way, I hope everybody's good and we're excited to kind of get back in the swing of things here for 5 more weeks. Um, this is what we'll be covering here in the 5 weeks, mostly the two world wars, the Russian Revolution, and a little bit afterwards. So that'll be kind of the focus of things the rest of the way. And then after that, we'll see what develops. So anyway, um, so what we're going to talk about for these next 2 weeks are the First World War and the Russian Revolution, kind of two big events that happened early in the century. A little bit different now. We're focusing on a specific event, unlike the other units where we're focusing on long periods. So all this happened that we're going to talk about here happened, over the period of about 5 years. It really, really went a long way in changing the future of the world. World War One was a horribly, horribly devastating conflict. We don't learn as much about World War One in America as you would in Europe because the United States wasn't as involved in the First World War as we were in World War Two. And while World War One didn't have the genocidal atrocities of, say, something like the Holocaust or the what Stalin was doing in Russia during that time, World War One was a far, far more devastating conflict in terms of combat lives lost. And when you're talking about horrible atrocities, the different things that were done to soldiers uh, in the fighting and just the trying of new technologies in conflict made this war really, really bad. So let's kind of go ahead and talk a little bit about the background. So World War One is also generally called the Great War because really at the time it was the biggest war the world had ever seen. World War One actually has three names. Most commonly, it's known as World War One, and obviously was only called that after World War Two had happened. But at the time of it happening, people referred to it as the Great War because they'd never seen war like this. World War One is also referred to as the war to end all wars because the scale and the involvement and the number of countries and people involved and the death tolls and casualties were so much further beyond anything the world had ever seen before in any conflict that this war was just on a whole nother scale relative to wars that had happened beforehand. So World War One, the Great War, and the war to end all wars. Essentially, what the war was the outcome of a lot of tension that had existed between a lot of European nations throughout much of the 1800s. Now, we've talked a lot about wars between England and France that occurred, really all throughout the history of Europe. But there are also tensions between other countries in Europe, most notably Germany. Germany has tensions with a lot of other countries. And again, this all goes back to, if you think way back to when we were together in school and we were talking about the Middle Ages and we talked about uh, kind of the different ethnic groups and peoples that populated Europe during this time. That actually plays a role in the long term happening of the First World War. Remember, these people have connections with their similar ethnic backgrounds and things like that. So, what's going to happen over time is the tensions that has existed between these different cultural groups tend to ignite and become worse and worse, and they drag one another in the conflict and in the war. And we see that kind of occur here around the late 1800s and into the early 1900s um, as disputes between these European countries become more and more. There's a lot that goes into this. Imperialism is a factor. These different countries compete with one another for imperial power in Africa and Southeast Asia and the other places we've learned about throughout the school year. Okay, and this creates resentment between one another. It creates problems between the countries, and ultimately that all boils over through a series of alliances through conflict and tension and the stuff that happens leading up to and ultimately causing World War I. Another thing that stands out about the First World War, and I kind of mentioned this before, is the many, many new technology innovations that first appeared during World War I. Remember, we're in the age of the Industrial Revolution. By 1914, there's assembly lines. Cars are on the road in great number. New means of weapons, of course, also are going to become important, right? Planes, flight had been invented by then. So it's another tool for conflict to use planes in battle. World War I is the first war in which we saw any real significant aerial combat take place between countries. But the technologies that are used in World War I, and we'll talk about it more specifically in the coming days, are so far beyond anything we'd seen before. And one of the big problems, maybe the biggest problem in World War I, and this is why the casualties were so high, was because the technology was so far beyond military strategy at that time. Remember, military strategy for centuries had always been your guys line up on one side, your guys line up on the other, and everybody start shooting at each other. Well, when you only had one shot, you had to reload your weapon. That was a lot easier to do and stay alive than it is when both sides have machine guns or what they called repeating rifles and Gatling guns back then that could mow down, hundreds of people at one time. And this is one of the many things, another one of the many things that makes World War I so devastating in terms of the actual combat. So, how did World War I happen? There's a lot of causes that go behind it, that are behind the cause of World War I. And many of you probably know this. The immediate cause has to do with this guy, a Serbian terrorist by the name of Gavrilo Princip. Now, what happened that caused the war ultimately was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, okay, by Princip, Gavrilo Princip, right here, okay. He was a Serbian nationalist, basically a terrorist, and a member of a group known as the Black Hand, okay. So here's what happened. So Austria and Hungary at this time were one country. It was called Austria-Hungary. Now they're, of course, two separate countries. And Austria's Archduke, who is like the crown prince, he's the guy that's going to be the next king of the empire, is in Serbia, which is part of Yugoslavia, modern day Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And so Princip is planning to assassinate the Archduke. And so he's in Serbia while the Archduke is in this parade. Now his first attempt is to create a bomb that's going to blow up the car that the Archduke and his wife are in. But the bomb doesn't go off right, and it misses the target, and that whole thing's a fiasco. So instead, Princip dresses in a cop's uniform, in a police uniform, and while he diverts the car that was carrying the Archduke, he diverts the car down this road and into this alleyway because of the bomb. And he says, you got to come over here for safety. As soon as the vehicle is pulled over, Princip pulls out a gun and shoots and kills the Archduke and his wife. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, it's not a big deal. It's a big deal in the sense that, a future head of state has been assassinated. But how is this event going to lead to a massive world war? Well, that lies in the political issues that were going on between countries in Europe during that time, in particular Germany, who was looking for an excuse to drag other European countries into conflict and war. Okay, so this is the immediate cause. At the end of the day, it's more like the catalyst for the war to happen. The long-term causes, which we'll get into here in a second, are really what's behind World War One and what makes it as bad as it is. So you're always going to hear that the assassination of the Archduke is what started the war. But that's more of a catalyst and an immediate cause. But we're talking about really the long-term issues that existed between these countries. Okay, so what are the long-term causes? Well, number one, you have nationalism. Okay, nationalism between the European countries. Uh, every European country is proud of their background, whether you're English or you're French or you're Russian or you're Belgian or you're German. You think that your country, that your culture is superior and is the best. Okay, with that great deal of pride in your country. Remember, that's what nationalism is defined as, having extreme pride in your country. You're going to believe that in case there's some sort of conflict and there's some sort of war, your country, being the best country, will be able to prevail in that conflict. Another long-term cause is imperialism. I mentioned this before. Again, imperialism, by definition, is when larger countries impose their political, military, and economic strength over weaker countries. All of these European countries, all the big ones, Spain, France, England, Germany, and the Dutch, had been, and the Russians to a certain degree, had been imperializing, so to speak, all over the world for quite some time. Okay, and in doing this, they come into conflict with one another as they try to gain more land and more territory. This creates more resentment. This creates disdain. This creates dislike between, say, a Germany and a France, or a Russia and a Germany, or whoever, because of these countries fighting with each other, arguing with each other, racing against each other to try to exploit people in Africa, South America, and Asia for their resources. A lot of resentment grows. Another one is militarism. So all these things are kind of isms here, right? Militarism is basically the glorification of one's military. Okay, with all the new technologies and all the new things being developed early in the 20th century, all of these European countries felt that, well, they have the best military, they have the best technology, they have all the things that they need to strengthen, their power over other countries. And with militarism, by definition, being the glorification of military, you want the opportunity to show off your new weapons, to show off the strength of your military, and show these other countries how powerful you really are. You take all these three together and you mix them up with some of the problems that were going on within these countries, something we call internal disorder. Write that down also, internal disorder. So you take these isms and the internal disorder in many European countries at this time, you have a recipe for war. And these countries, England, Germany, France in particular, and Russia, thought that war would be the solution to the problems, to the internal disorder that was going on in all these European countries at the time. Now, the final and probably the most important long-term cause of the war is something called the alliance system, an alliance between different European countries building up in the years leading up to the war. And I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. Okay, so the alliance system that existed between countries is simply that, a system of alliances between European countries that helps plunge Europe in further into war. Okay, it is a principal cause, and it's going to be the one that ultimately makes this war as devastating as it is. Next time, I'm going to go specifically over how kind of we got to this point, but the alliance system is a really, really big problem that really dragged all these European countries into this major conflict. Okay, now the alliances date back to um, really to the 1800s. Okay, it begins in 1882. Write down that year, 1882. I'll try to do it here, but you know I'm terrible at that. Begins in 18. It begins in 1882 with something called the Triple Alliance. Okay, um, it was a there was an alliance formed in 1882 between Germany and Austria-Hungary and Italy that was kind of um, there was kind of a loose alliance that basically said, hey, if any country threatens you, we have your back, right? So this triple alliance is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in 1882. Okay, and they basically say, look, for instance, Italy, if you get invaded by Greece, Germany and Austria-Hungary will, um, you know, have your back. Will, you know, fight alongside you in case that happens. These weren't really strong official alliances; they were loose alliances. But you know, we're seeing kind of the formation of what ultimately is going to become the war effort here. Okay, so and shortly after that, in 1894, an alliance was formed between France and Russia. They didn't give it a name yet because I don't know, they just didn't. Because Germany didn't really like France and or Russia, so France and Russia figured, well, if Germany doesn't like us, then we maybe should become allies in case Germany threatens either France or Russia. Now you got to understand, by this time, Germany was an emerging power in the world. Was maybe the most powerful industrial country in the world at the turn of the 20th century, nearly every bit as powerful overall as like a Great Britain. So you're talking about the power structure of the world at the turn of the 20th century. At the very top, you have Britain, France, Germany, United States, Russia, and Japan, and a couple other countries in there too. But that's the power structure. So the United States isn't the most powerful country in the world yet, but Germany is appearing to kind of become that powerful country. In 1907, I'm going to try to write that again. 1907. Ha! That's a really terrible seven. Anyway, in 1907, the Triple Entente is formed. That includes the alliance between France and Russia, but now England joins up in that too, which is a really big deal. And it tells you how bad of a potential enemy Germany is, because remember, England and France hate each other and always have. But Germany becoming a bigger threat um, makes them say, well, maybe we need to let bygones be bygones and ally together against the growing threat of Germany. So ultimately, these alliances get renamed. The Triple Alliance ultimately gets renamed the Central Powers, and that's mainly Austria-Hungary, and that's mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary. Uh, and then the Triple Entente is the Allies. Simply call themselves the Allies. That's France, Belgium, Russia, England, later on the United States. Italy starts off as a member of the Central Powers, but then switches to the Allies. So Italy drops out of the Central Powers / Triple Alliance and joins in with the Allies. Maybe they just felt like, you know, that's the better long-term opportunity. So anyway, so that's how these alliances formed and how everything kind of came together or came apart in the years leading up to the war. Next time, next set of notes, it'll be tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit more about the buildup to the war and some of the things that happened at the beginning. It's a lot more interesting, folks, and we're actually able to do it in class together. But, you know, we're doing our best to make it work. Hope everybody's well. See you tomorrow.